Okay, so today's lesson's focus is going to be on Canada's treatment of Aboriginals in the post-World War II era in its attempt to try to create a just society or a fair society. We're going to start by going all the way back to the Indian Act of 1876. This is the act that defines what an Indian is. The original act did not define Indians as Inuit or Métis. They would have been separate from this. Back then, they're hoping Inuit and Métis could be assimilated into non-Aboriginal cultures back then. Today, Métis and Inuit, I believe, are a part of the Indian Act, but this is the original one back in 1876. The Indian Act also states that reserve lands are not owned by the Aboriginal groups. They're there to manage it. The land still is owned by the Crown, or Canada still owns land. It also gives Aboriginals the right to decide who can be on their land or not, on the reserve lands. It also says that Aboriginals are responsible for maintaining roads and bridges that are on reserve lands. It also states that the federal government can take reserve lands away from the Aboriginals for the purposes of public infrastructure. So if they're building highways, if they're building pipelines that need to kind of run through a reserve, they can actually take that land away from them and build that infrastructure. It also lays out rules for the elections of band councils. The Indian Act is what makes sales tax, or Aboriginals exempt from sales tax on reserve lands. All of the taxes, though, like income tax and whatever else that we have to pay, they do pay as well. So it's just sales tax on reserve lands that they're exempt from. It says that the resources that are on the reserves still belong to the Crown, still belong to the government. The Aboriginals can sell it, though, with permission from the government. And one of the other things it talks about is how the reserves are kind of set up with the band council's powers. And essentially, they're set up like municipalities, like cities. So with the Indian Act in place, we need to ask the question whether or not this Indian Act has been part of a just society or not. Therefore, do we need to change it? So let's see some of the results of the Indian Act, and we'll see kind of stats or report done by StatCan in 2006 about where Aboriginals are. So when we take a look at this, I'll just quickly jump down to education. And what we'll see here is the percentage of Aboriginal populations aged 25 to 54 that have graduated or attained a certain degree at a certain level. So with trades, you can actually see it's a pretty good number for Aboriginal populations. So First Nations 13%, Métis at 16%, Inuit at 13%, and in comparison to non-native populations who only have 12% trade certificate or a trade diploma. With college, it balances out a little bit more. The Métis are pretty comparable to the non-Aboriginal populations, but we do start to see First Nations and Inuit kind of dropping in having college degrees. And the biggest difference is with university degrees. And you can see that 25% of the non-Aboriginal population has some sort of university degree, whereas even Métis, even only 9%, First Nations 7%, and Inuit only 4%. So we see a big gap in terms of university education for Aboriginals. We can also take a look at employment levels. And so first what they start off with is total Aboriginal population. That's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit all combined. And that averages about 66% are employed. If you compare that to the non-Aboriginal population at 82%, there's a big difference between the two. And so we see issues being created in employment as well, so education, employment. We can also take a look at income, which should be connected to the other two. And we take a look at income. Again, here's the average for Aboriginal populations, and if you compare that to the non-Aboriginal population, it's far behind. Right, 33,000 on average for non-Aboriginal populations, and 22,000. So that's a big difference between the two. You could go on and look at all the different sets of data, but it all points to Aboriginal societies falling, or Aboriginal cultures falling behind, and this is with the Indian Act in place. So the Indian Act clearly isn't helping the Aboriginals. So to answer that question, it clearly is not part of a just society. If anything, it's possibly keeping them at a disadvantage, or it's at least created a situation where they're at a disadvantage. So how has Canada tried to rectify this? One attempt came in 1969 with something called the White Paper. I'll read out this introduction to what the White Paper is, and then we'll explain a little bit more about what it's about. This is a statement from the government about what to do with Aboriginal populations. It says, to be an Indian is to be a man. With all a man's needs and abilities, to be an Indian is also to be different. It is to speak different languages, draw different pictures, tell different tales, and to rely on a set of values developed in a different world. Canada is richer for its Indian component, although there have been times when diversity seemed of little value to many Canadians. But to be a Canadian Indian today is to be someone different in another way. It is to be someone apart in law, apart in the provision of government services, and too often apart in social contacts. To be an Indian is to lack power, the power to act as owner of your lands, the power to spend your own money, and too often the power to change your own condition. Not always, but too often, to be an Indian is to be without a job, a good house, or running water, without knowledge, training, or technical skill, and above all, without those feelings of dignity and self-confidence that a man must have if he is to walk with his head held high. And so this is back in 1969, but when we looked at the data for even 2006, that situation is still the same. Here's the key part in what this White Paper is asking for. All these conditions of the Indians are the product of history and have nothing to do with their abilities and capacities. Indian relations with other Canadians began with special treatment by government and society, and special treatment has been the rule since Europeans first settled in Canada. Special treatment has made the Indians a community disadvantaged and apart. Obviously, the course of history must be changed. To be an Indian must be to be free to develop Indian cultures in an environment of legal, social, and economic equality with other Canadians. If you remember the questions I gave to Sam George, if you can remember all the way back there, I asked him about what should be done with the Indian Act, and this is exactly what he said, that Canada really needs to take away all those advantages and let Aboriginals be free, and then they'll kind of figure it out. And that's really what the White Paper was trying to offer to Aboriginals. So essentially, if you want to sum all that up, that 1969 White Paper suggested that Aboriginals be treated like all other citizens. So you remove the Indian Act, and ideally you remove the Indian Act, and then they don't have any special rights. So, by the way, a White Paper is just a general idea of a statement of policy. It's not to create laws, but if they accepted the White Paper, then one of the steps following it would have been to get rid of the Indian Act. So, as you saw there, the goal of the White Paper is to try to abolish that Indian status, to try to get rid of any special treatment given to Aboriginals. And what might kind of surprise you is that Aboriginals at the time disagreed with this. The problem being, they thought if you take away that, almost like with Quebec, that identification of almost a distinct society, they saw this as cultural genocide, that if you take away all these special rights of what has kind of made Aboriginals what they are at the time, you'd be forcing them to kind of fit in with mainstream Canadian society. And that's how they saw it, as cultural genocide. You've removed everything that, in law, would have made them Aboriginal. So the Aboriginal population at the time was strongly opposed to this. Instead, what they're asking for is, rather than change the Indian status, give them self-government. And you heard Harold Cardinal there talking about it. He said there's an Aboriginal Affairs minister, someone from the government who watches over the Aboriginals. Why not just let the Aboriginals watch over the Aboriginals, is what they're starting to ask for. So with the lack of popularity of this White Paper in 1969, it's pretty much put on the back burner. It's put away. So nothing is done because of it. So to try to get a sense of possibly self-government, Aboriginals start to organize themselves. 1968, so this is even before the White Paper, there's the National Indian Brotherhood. They get formed. In 1980, they changed the name to Assembly of First Nations. The Assembly of First Nations meets once a year, so it's a gathering of all the chiefs from across Canada. There's about 630 of them, and together they will elect a head chief or national chief, sorry. And currently, that national chief is Perry Bellegarde. And so what they do is they pretty much form a group to kind of protect Aboriginal rights and to discuss Aboriginal issues. This national chief is elected every 3 years. So the issue of education came up as well because at that time in the 60s we still had residential schools, but we'll show you what happens with education for Aboriginals and what Canada has tried to do. In 1948, residential schools stopped becoming compulsory. However, Aboriginals, of course, still would have there would still be Aboriginals going to these schools. And in fact, it was in the 50s that we had the highest number of Aboriginals attending residential schools, and that was mainly because of the baby boom. You could see that in the chart here, that after World War II, we get to about this is probably about the mid-50s or so, and we have the highest number of residential school students that we've ever had. And then it starts to drop off after the 60s, or in the 60s. In 1951, the Indian Act allows women to vote in band elections, and if you remember all the way back in, I think it was 1884, the potlatch was banned. It's not brought back until 1951, and all those other kind of cultural celebrations that Aboriginals would have. 1960s, the governments will start to fund Aboriginals leaving reserves and going to public schools. So rather than forcing them to go to residential schools, they'll try to support Aboriginals in trying to get an education that's comparable to what all other Canadians can find. Often what that meant, of course, is they have to leave their communities. And we'll show you a little clip of how that's working today in a moment. 1969 marks an end to residential schools, so this is when Canada's going to start to phase them all out and instead try to put education of Aboriginals back in the hands of band leaders. The problem, though, with a lot of reserves is that they didn't have secondary schools, so they might be able to fund some sort of primary education, but to get some sort of secondary education, they'd often have to leave the reserves, and so again, we'll show you the result of that today. Because of this, many don't make it to graduation, and that's probably what explains what the stats show, that a lot of them don't end up going into higher education. So even with trades and college, the numbers are still fairly low. It's only maximum around 20%, and that was for the Métis. Definitely if you look at university, those rates are very, very low. To try to fix the wrongs done in the residential schools, 1998, there's an Aboriginal Healing Fund that's put together. The federal government, it's a one-time fund. They put aside $350 million to try to fund programs that help Aboriginals kind of deal with the situation of being in residential schools, deal with the trauma of being in residential schools. The United Church of Canada also decided to help out as well. They have a healing fund also that started in 1994, taking some of the responsibility as the church to try to help Aboriginals out too because of the residential schools. The very last residential school in BC is 1983, and the very last one in all of Canada was Saskatchewan, and that was only 1996, which is not actually that long ago. 2008, again, I mentioned this when we were talking to Sam George, and I asked him how he felt about this. Here is Stephen Harper's apology for the residential schools in 2008. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. In the 1870s, the federal government, partly in order to meet its obligations to educate Aboriginal children, began to play a role in the development and administration of these schools. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child.
Okay, so remember when I asked Sam George about this, he didn't really like that apology, didn't feel that it was very sincere. You can decide for yourself. Here are the last residential schools, by the way. So the one I mentioned in BC was actually in Tofino. This is the one that closed down in 1983. And the last one in all of Canada was in Saskatchewan. This is Gordon School in Saskatchewan.